Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to this session on climate adaptation in the most vulnerable contexts, lessons from UNDP evaluations. Hello to everybody out there at the Evidence and Climate Action Pavilion at COP30 in Belém, and very warm welcome also to our participants online. My name is Tina Torjman-Nebe. I'm an evaluation advisor out of UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Ben Murphy, who is a senior evaluation specialist and the author of this paper, as well as by Nessie Golokai Gould, who is the resident representative of UNDP Eswatini, and will share some experiences with us. Before we jump into the lessons of the paper, let me say a few words about the reflection series, which is what this paper is a part of. So the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP started doing these papers during COVID, when we couldn't travel and collect primary data. We realized we're sitting on a wealth of documentation, past evaluations, over 7,000 of them. So at that time in 2020, we started writing them up as lessons papers around specific issues that were of relevance to decision makers at the time. And it was so popular in UNDP that we continued doing those papers. We have more than 20 of them now uploaded on our web space. And we're very, very pleased to present the latest one today. These papers typically look at what works, what doesn't, and why. And today's paper on adapting to climate change draws on some 37 evaluations. About half of them are independent country program evaluations conducted by our office. And the other half are at country level project evaluations, or also some corporate thematic evaluations were synthesized here. You will see that the evidence really is very recent, dating from the last 3 to 4 years. And that was quite important because the field is evolving so fast, and there's always a time lag between what we evaluate and when the activities actually have taken place. So this paper is about UNDP's support. This is where we're drawing lessons from, but we hope that it will be relevant to many of you. It covers things that many stakeholders are struggling with: financing adaptation, engaging the private sector, and how to understand if support is having a positive effect in general. And so before we go into the lessons, Ben, may I ask you to quickly sum up for us UNDP's work in climate adaptation, just to set the scene?
Sure, thank you, Tina, and welcome to all, whether you're at COP or not. I won't be able to do this justice here, but all of UNDP's climate work comes under a portfolio or an umbrella called the Climate Promise. This portfolio, it works in both mitigation and adaptation support, but for today, obviously, we're looking at the adaptation work. And it works in over 100 countries. And most of those, over half, are either least developed countries or the SIDS. And it works at a range of levels, with national governments working on adaptation policy, planning and financing, and obviously the nationally determined contributions as part of the Paris Agreement. But then it also works through various levels of government down to the local level when promoting locally led innovative solutions for the most vulnerable populations. I think we'll hear more of this from Nessie and Eswatini, but I'll leave it there for now, Tina. Thank you. You're on mute, Tina, sorry.
Thank you for the intro, Ben. And you've come up with 7 lessons there in your paper, covering everything from national to local adaptation programming, the role of climate information, the risk of maladaptation, and others. But your paper is specifically focused on the most vulnerable contexts. What lessons did you identify for how adaptation can take place in these contexts, Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. So We distinguish obviously there are particularly vulnerable countries to climate change, and then you know there are also particularly vulnerable contexts within these countries and other countries. Um, Often where people are living on marginal lands and or beyond the reach of an effective public service or private sector interest. So this is why the paper emphasizes and actually starts with local capacities, as it's these that are deployed first in the event of a hazard, and importantly, to minimize the uncertainty about how climate change may manifest locally. And I think some of the most positive approaches that we see from the evidence are where UNDP has worked at this level to create, say, climate maps and to think through locally what may be happening in the future relating to climate change, how these intersect with existing problems, perhaps, in the natural environment or perhaps around agricultural planning or disaster risk reduction plans. So there's some particularly good examples of this. Peru, Uganda, Nepal country offices have had really quite strong programming in there. I think all of those countries as well, they were done in quite remote mountainous regions, and then some have been scaled to other parts of the country. And this approach of working at the community level to build plans, it acknowledges that yes, people live in vulnerable contexts, but these are also the same people that have the best understanding of that context and also a lot of experience in dealing with hazards and uncertainty. So the stronger programs that we've reviewed seem to have kind of gathered this expertise into local plans, which has also been a good opportunity to formalize awareness of climate change as a future threat. There may be a good understanding of climate change, or there may be just a sense that seasons have changed or natural conditions have changed in the past 10 or so years. But this is a good opportunity to then to bring in some of the meteorological information and the science behind this. And then these programs have also used the plans as the basis then for attracting more support to these areas. That might be social protection, as is the case in Peru, or agricultural extension support, or even climate information services. And because these plans often express a community contribution, say to ecosystem management or conservation or building defensive infrastructure, this can also be leveraged for, say, payments or for climate insurance, for example, as a contribution to climate insurance. Obviously, this is only an entry point rather than a silver bullet. And one of the challenges that some of the evaluations have highlighted about the approach is that you're working in the most vulnerable context, that the scale of immediate needs may be quite large. And in opening up the discussion in this way, you can um, you very understandably come up with a long list of things that need to be addressed in the near term. So the challenge has been to ensure that the unique and the future risks of climate change are are prioritized amongst this list of more immediate challenges. And the evaluations suggest that perhaps, to do that, programmers could promote kind of an adaptive mindset through the process. That might seem like a bit of a buzzword into the plan, but what I think it means is that rather than establishing a single, potentially time-bound solution, that the plans should include a diversity of options within them. And then also importantly, you know, skills development and information needed to choose between different options in the future. This might be the particular seeds to use for the coming season, or which livelihoods are more likely to be rewarding in the current or future market conditions, or even infrastructure that can be modified or abandoned as context or the conditions change. I think the paper also highlights the risks of not doing this. Finding four in particular on maladaptation, where you can see the limits or some of the challenges, the unintended consequences of promoting something that addresses today's challenges. And obviously, in many cases, for very understandable reasons, it might be on coastal areas where a seawall has been built because of the impact of typhoons um, or in arid areas where there's a immediate need for water and for pasture. But several evaluations point to the challenges with that, perhaps not seeing what's in the wider context and how other people outside of the project may be impacted by, an intention to extract more water from the water table. And interestingly, there was one project that had a very good climate information service that triggered an alert to say that coming planting season, there may be a drought, and unintentionally that triggered people then to extract water a lot earlier and produced the conditions for a drought very early. So lastly, I think, obviously working in the most remote areas, the sustainability of these services and these projects and these new ideas, that can fall off after the program closes. That came up in several pieces of evidence throughout the evaluations. And that's why in lesson 5, which you download the paper and take a look at that, you'll see what's happening or what UNDP is doing at that national level, looking at national planning and how some of the barriers that have been faced there, but also different financing options for adaptation, acknowledging that it's much more difficult or less attractive than, say, funding mitigation work. But there's some interesting innovations under that part of the paper that may spark people's curiosity. Over to you, Tina.
Thanks a lot, Ben, for laying out there some of the entry points for reaching most vulnerable contexts and also talking about the adaptive mindset and the risk of inaction in this area. Nessie, let me now turn to you and some of Eswatini country office's work. Some of it is captured in the paper, but we'd love for you to give us a broader picture of how climate change is impacting the country, how UNDP is responding, and what challenges you are facing. Over to you, Nessie.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting the UNDP Swatini Country Office to share our experience on this platform. Indeed, Eswatini has been one of those countries that has been quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We've seen rising temperatures lead to drought-like situations. Fewer rainy days, but the fewer rainy days being of greater intensity, leading to isolated flooding with high velocity winds and also occasional hailstorms. As you can imagine, all of these manifestations have had an immense negative impact on the agricultural sector, especially in a country where a significant population of the country depends on agriculture as its livelihood. Last year, we saw food vulnerability affecting 25% of the population. This has decreased somewhat to 12% this year. Showing the impacts on food security, but also in terms of GDP, where some of the GDP comes from agriculture, especially from sugar production and export. The impact also on infrastructure is apparent as well. Where we are seeing increased flooding and high wind velocity destroying infrastructure, especially if we talk about schools and educational facilities. And we've also seen destruction of natural habitats and biodiversity. So in terms of our response to that, we've had sort of three-tiered response to that. At the policy level, as you said, how do we plan adaptation through various policy instruments and also strategies. And I'll give an example of wildfire, which has been exacerbated by climate change due to drought, supporting the development of a national but also localized fire prevention strategies. We've also supported institutional capacities, for example, through early warning system. And I think that goes to your improving climate information so that people can prepare and be able to adapt better. But we've also supported community level interventions such as climate resilient agriculture, and in terms of infrastructure, piloting the permeable pavements, pavements that can absorb water, reduce flooding, and also make that water available for use in agriculture or other sources. Challenges have been, and I think Ben has already mentioned it, financing. How do you finance that nationally and locally and get private sector involved? But very importantly, how do you drive change, both at the institutional and the community level? Because this requires a recognition that this change it's not just isolated, it could be long-term. And how do we change our practices and way of doing businesses to adapt to the changing climate? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nessie, for laying out those achievements and challenges from UNDP Eswatini. We're here at the Evidence for Climate Action Pavilion. So I'd like to follow up with a question around evidence, actually one each. Nessie, you mentioned several challenges on working on adaptation. And I was wondering, what are the most difficult aspects to understand or measure about how your support is working?
Yes. In countries like Eswatini, data, of course, is a challenge. Collecting data, interpreting data, and using that data to inform change. One of the biggest problems we've had, of course, is just how do we set adequate baselines that recognize the multifaceted aspects of the program, of the intervention that we're trying to do, and what would be the most context appropriate tools for measuring progress and also attributing change. I think this is something we've struggled with, moving away from, can I call them, traditional means of data collection to more context-specific, light and responsive tools that can give us the status of where we are at now, but also enable us to continue to monitor, noting that finances are a constraint. And part of that measurement also is around behavior. How can we assess behavioral change at the household level? And how can we use that data to inform the strategies that we need to employ to drive the change that we need both at community, at household, community, and institutional level?
Thanks a lot, Nessie. And I think you already partially answered there Arunjana's question in the chat about the time lag also between
Yes.
being prone to disasters and realizing that the patterns of disasters are actually aggravated by climate change, and what are the kinds of data and tools we could use. So thanks for that. Ben, thinking back to the 37 evaluations that you used for the paper, and also keeping in mind another question in the chat there, perhaps on methodology and how you synthesized. What did you find about the way evaluations assess climate adaptation?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. broadly speaking, whenever an evaluation was claiming that climate resilience had been built, it was often, from reading the report, it often appeared to be, I would say, an overclaim. And I think there's particular reasons for that. One being that, obviously the truest test of adaptation is in the face of shocks and stresses, and people being able to find different pathways or different strategies, and to perhaps reduce the impact of that stress, or continue to develop despite of it. And I don't think, that's obviously a very hard thing to test, and there's obviously ethical questions around and testing that. So, but because most evaluations didn't have the option of testing that, wherever there was a kind of a claim to say the project has built climate resilience, yeah, it didn't seem to have been the case. Obviously, this is a general statement, and some evaluations were taking a more cautious approach to it than others, but some did have that as an overclaim, and actually, I think some of that came back to um, issues with the project log frame, where perhaps a single indicator might be used as an example of climate resilience. Perhaps the adoption of new climate smart agricultural techniques, or increased incomes, which are all important, but are only kind of one part of it. And I think, as I mentioned, the issues around adaptation show that you can't really take a single a single technological solution to this. And it wasn't too clear that the evaluations had looked very deeply at the capacities of those that are at risks, to see whether they had existing capacities and where there might be gaps. Um, so yeah, so it raised a few alarm bells. I think, Nessie alluded to this. A lot of thinking went into resilience measurement, and there are critiques that that's quite a heavy and expensive process, which it is to do large surveys like that. But there is potentially a middle ground if evaluators can assess, what capacities people do and do not have, and then where there are gaps. And building on what Nessie was saying, I think there's been a movement, not that we saw in this paper, but outside of this, towards more participatory M&E, so the involvement of communities in climate adaptation M&E, and that I think comes back full circle to what I mentioned at the start. Um, Working from local plans to then perhaps, that being a moment to express what a community considers to be their adaptation goals, and what signs that they would use to track or understand whether they're making greater progress to this or not, and where they have gaps. Um, so yeah, on the whole, acknowledging that evaluations can only capture a certain thing at a certain point in time, any kind of confident statement that resilience was being built was often not evidenced in the report itself. Not to say that it wasn't happening. Just to come back to the question of how we came about this paper, it's actually a methodology that all of these 20 reflections papers that Tina mentioned use, and that is to do a kind of a systematic search through our evaluation resource center, those 7,000 evaluations. So to do that, we came up obviously with a set of keywords or search terms that are relevant to the topic. We were aided in some way by the fact that this platform also has an AI function, so it can accurately identify where some of this evidence is. And then it became a process of bringing that together, and inductive, deductive reasoning to bring out the main lessons from the paper. And then lastly, to kind of, to divide that by context, so we could see what would be relevant for SIDS, or what would be relevant in arid, or other different types of contexts. So I'll hand back to you, Tina. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I think, yeah, we answered several questions in the chat already. on the question of the institutional response in UNDP to those papers. Anna Kunova, who's also here on the call, are coordinating the series, and I think our experience has been very positive. Because basically these papers are demand-led. They come out of UNDP stakeholder requests, and then we take a kind of top-down and bottom-up logic to address the papers. We look at what is happening in the field. We speak to stakeholders to understand where the pain points are, and then we look at the evidence base. So the papers are written up kind of directly in response to stakeholder questions, and actually, they are more loved than our evaluation reports, which sometimes come with more of a, to stakeholders. So positive response there overall. I don't know if Anna, you'd like to add anything from your experience on the methodology or the question of reception.
Yeah, on the methodology, I'd like to add that it's still developing. In each paper, we are trying to improve, not only in terms of how we are gathering the topics from the stakeholders. Just to respond to the question that just appeared in the chat, the stakeholders are typically UNDP colleagues. And also we are trying to improve the papers in terms of methodology. As Ben mentioned, we have an AI tool whose development is ongoing. So now it's helping us to sort out the most relevant papers and to do a search which a human wouldn't be possible. For a human, it wouldn't be possible to do. And then it continues with human-led analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, for adding that. I see there's a lot of interest in the question on engaging with community members. Nessie, perhaps you have any thoughts on this? I can say that for us, as we sit in a centralized evaluation office in New York, we're very far removed from communities in that sense. We're writing these papers on the basis of already published evaluation reports, so we don't typically share them back to communities because it wouldn't be meaningful. But we do share them with our country offices, so they may be used in country office outreach or a stakeholder engagement. I don't know, Nessie, if you have any additional thoughts on this.
We haven't used the papers per se, but what we've tried to do is to do some post-project evaluations and get some lessons learned. And I think the interesting question of maladaptation and how can we better work with communities to prevent that. So in one of the interventions that we did around climate smart agriculture, introducing drip irrigation, I think insufficient time was taken to integrate local knowledge around water sources and how that would affect the proposed solution thereof, which has now led into a situation where rather than providing drip irrigation, we've actually reduced access to irrigation rather than improving the lot of the community. So I think engaging community, listening, learning, and doing the best we can to integrate that knowledge at the beginning and throughout the intervention is necessary to ensure that we are co-creating the most relevant adaptation measures within communities.
Thank you so much, Nessie, for those additions. And colleagues, I think we have reached the end of our brief webinar. Thank you so much for joining us out there in the Evidence for Climate Action Pavilion at COP, as well as online. We appreciate your comments and your interest. Thanks a lot to Nessie Golokai Gold joining us from Eswatini, as well as to Ben Murphy and Anna Kunova out of UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office. If you would like to download the paper, please use the QR code that's on the screen right now. and also sign up to our mailing list to hear more. We have reflections papers coming out about 3-4 times a year, and there are some interesting topics coming up on just and green transition. We also have past papers online that may be of interest on energy access and climate and health system strengthening. So take a look and let's keep learning together. And thanks a lot for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.